One of our first presentations today is from Nutanix. So we will be handing over to them shortly, who then they will give us a rundown on how to enable the digital transformation journey. We have presenters from Nutanix, which is Matt Maw. He's the head of technology strategy for Australia and New Zealand. And we will hand over to Matt for his presentation starting very shortly.
Okay, so again, thank you very much for the opportunity to engage and have a chat. It's always great to engage, whether it's virtual or in person. So, look, from a Nutanix perspective, hopefully most people on the call has a bit of an idea who we are. But just to maybe for those of you who aren't familiar with us. We are a global company, about 7,000 employees, about $4 billion worth of market cap, about $1.5 billion a year worth of revenue. We have customers throughout the Fortune 500 and customers across the world. So we're a decent player in the infrastructure space. We are a software provider of infrastructure capability. So it's really about for us, helping organizations on a journey to digitalization and the transformation that inevitably comes with it. So look, let me sort of crack on. I think I've got about 20 minutes or so, so we'll try and stick to time. Look, from our perspective, organizations are in one of two camps these days. They're either disrupting the industry that they work in, or they are being disrupted. And there's really not a lot of area in between the two, to be perfectly honest. What we are finding is that for a lot of organizations and or government departments that feel as though they're not being disrupted or disrupting, what's actually happening is that oftentimes they're being disrupted. They just don't know it yet, or it hasn't come to fruition yet. But the world is changing at a massively rapid pace. Really good example. I used to be the CTO of Tax Group. We used to run all the lotteries. We had the monopolistic license from the government. It was illegal for anybody else to run a lottery within the country. And so we thought we were in a nice little monopolistic protected world, and we weren't being disrupted. Unfortunately, somebody worked out that a sports bet could just as easily be a bet on a race or on a football game as it could be on a whole lot of balls dropping out of a machine. And so they came along, and lo and behold, suddenly you can now place bets on the US Powerball and so forth. So just a really good story of something that's even monopolistic and protected by government licenses still isn't a business that's immune from being disrupted. And look, I think it's fair to say that there's almost not an industry in the country that hasn't been in some way, shape, or form disrupted by COVID-19. Whether it's work from home, whether it's changing of your retail, whether it's your employees, your customers. COVID-19 has turned the world on its head, and just another example of where we just need to be prepared that disruption is part of the day and what we're looking at. From more of an IT perspective or a workload perspective, Gartner's done some really interesting studies and reviews to really look at what's happening to sort of the corporate workload essentially. And if you look at it from a traditional perspective, often most workloads are housed within some sort of corporate data center, whether that's a colo or on-premise, but controlled predominantly by the corporate. Now, we've all seen a massive rise of the cloud over the last few years. And if you look at it, the view of the world is at the moment, or sort of in the last 12 months or so, about 80% of workloads reside within those corporate data centers. Public cloud's taken a huge share at about 19%. And there's about 1% of applications that sit out on the edge. Now, by definition of edge, that's anything from a device sitting on a truck in the middle of a mine in the Pilbara, all the way through to, say, a hospital in a public health setting, or in a school, or in anything that's not within that corporate data center. So that's quite a broad category of what edge looks like from a Gartner perspective. What is fascinating, and certainly what we're seeing across the industry segments, is that no doubt about it, the drive to the public cloud will continue, and the evacuation of those corporate data centers will will really double down and see a massive decline in workloads within those corporate data centers. As you see there, 80% going down to about 30%, or about half, a little over half the workloads disappearing out of those corporate data centers. But what's really interesting is the massive rise of workloads and applications being driven at the edge. And when you think about it, it kind of makes sense in a lot of respects, in that, ultimately what you've got is, as applications, some of them will centralize really well into a public cloud, but as demand for performance goes up, as we're trying to drive a better digital experience for customers, for employees, for interconnecting different data sets, for using high-res video in a CCTV world, for example, the need to have those applications deployed closer and closer to where they're being utilized is really going to become a bit of a theme and a need as organizations really look to evacuate those data centers. So essentially, we're going from a centralist view of data center. Now we've got some workloads going to the center, into the public cloud. We've got some workloads disappearing out to the edge. But certainly from a sheer percentage perspective, a 1% to 30% of workloads is certainly a huge shift. Now, these are global numbers. Whether or not we see the same sort of percentages in Australia, particularly with our geographical reach and things like NBN causing some challenges in various locations, but nevertheless, the trend is certainly consistent with what we're seeing in Australia. So when you think about that from an infrastructure perspective and what's happening sort of at a trend level, fundamentally what's happening, this is going to sound maybe weird coming from an infrastructure provider, but essentially what lines of business and consumers of IT really do care about is, it's not the infrastructure. Infrastructure is a relatively boring thing, a little bit like plumbing in your house. No one really cares about it until it goes wrong. But what they do care about is applications, and applications are king. Ultimately, it's about the workload, it's about the utilization, it's about using those applications to change the way that organizations engage with as I said, their employees, with their customers, with their suppliers, with their supply chain, depending on the industry you're at. I mean, if you look at, say, healthcare, there's a great stat from our public hospital system up in Queensland here, where when COVID hit, they had a 237% increase in telehealth, almost overnight. And so, what that was all about the application. It was all about the ability to drive those workloads out into a different model and different utilization. So if applications are king and that's what they really care about, then what currently happens as a generalization is that when applications are selected to meet the line of business needs and to meet the outcomes of that digital transformation, what happens is essentially IT makes a decision as to where they're going to host that application and how they're going to deliver it. Now, because we live in IT and because marketing's had a great old time over the last sort of decade, we typically call these clouds. But they could be a public cloud like an Azure or an AWS. It could be a managed hosted cloud through a third party. It could be your own private data center, which effectively is a type of cloud. Or it could be a distributed edge-based environment, whether that's a small-scale piece of infrastructure, whether it's an appliance type thing. But essentially, that from a collective noun perspective, that we view them all as clouds and the ability to deliver hosting or infrastructure out to those applications. The problem is that those applications are now tied to those particular ways of delivering. And as business needs change and as that disrupting and disruptor element comes into it, and the needs of businesses change far faster than what infrastructure can keep up. And the ability to move those applications across those clouds suddenly become an impediment for those applications to be deployed to meet those business needs. And we've all heard of the 7 R's, the refactor, the replatform, the et cetera, et cetera. Those projects really are about the ability to move those applications across those different hosting capabilities. And at the moment, IT is in the critical path, and oftentimes it's the reason why businesses can't adopt to those new capabilities and really adopt that digital transformation, because they're just too tied to that. And essentially, we have to architect capabilities that look 3, 4, 5 years in advance because of the complexity of moving applications across those different hosting capabilities. So essentially, if you think about it from an outcome perspective, ultimately what the nirvana is the ability to disassociate those applications from the underpinning infrastructure that run it, and then allow those applications to simply consume whatever infrastructure they need in whatever location they need to be in based on business needs rather than based on IT needs. And so that allows you to then look at those application and workloads and say, actually, you know what, it makes sense for us to host it in an edge location, say in a hospital, because that's where the medical device is, or that's where the patient is, or that's where it's being consumed. You know, maybe you now want to move that application back into a potentially a public cloud because you want to run some machine learning or some analytics across the top of it, or you want to, et cetera, et cetera. So ultimately you want that ability to have a disassociation between the hardware or the underpinning infrastructure and the applications. And essentially that's what Nutanix does, is that we create a capability that obfuscates all of those different types of capabilities that sit, all those clouds that sit underneath, and then really importantly creates a standard set of management and overview of all of those elements that sit in there, whether that's automation or software deployment, whether that's capacity planning, whether that's even something like basic Kubernetes deployments. Fundamentally what we do is we now create a single view across all of those different sorts of infrastructure. So from a business perspective, from an IT perspective, what you get is now you only have one set of capability you need to learn. So your employees now don't need to worry about, I need to manage an appliance at the edge, I need to manage my 3-tier infrastructure in my private cloud, and then I need to learn AWS and Azure and GCP. I've got 5 different ways of doing everything within my environment. Suddenly you've now got one front door and one capability that sits across all those different elements. Now, what's been interesting is a couple of people have sort of, when I have this conversation, they've sort of come back to me and said, oh, look, at the end of the day, we really only have, say a corporate data center and we've standardized on Azure or we've standardized on AWS. So we really don't have that many clouds. But when you think about it, particularly with that drive to that edge-based application deployment and that need for those edges, is that oftentimes we're seeing convergence of lots of different, typically non-IT workloads, such as building management systems, such as CCTV, say nurse call within healthcare or student learning systems within education. And what we're finding is that when you start to look at all of the different places where applications can be hosted, most organizations are running multiple clouds, 6, 8, some running 10 and 15 different types of clouds. When you look at it more broader as places where you can host infrastructure. And so this problem is really not so much about moving workloads from, say, an Azure to an AWS, but certainly about the ability to move those workloads across those different capabilities, across those different hosting elements and requirements as the needs of the businesses change. Again, from a COVID perspective, we've shown that they move a lot faster than what IT can keep up. Now, what's been really interesting is that as Nutanix sort of builds this out and kind of really understands and kind of looks at that, there may be some people on the call that recall over the last couple of weeks, Nutanix made a very big announcement to engage with Red Hat and build an engineered and partnered capability to bring the Red Hat OpenShift and all of the capabilities that they bring. And essentially, when you think about it, what they are doing is creating that next layer of depth that allows that microservices and all of the elements of containers to really come to the fore and now plug seamlessly into that layer of capability that exists between the infrastructure and the applications. So now what you get is you get all of the goodness and all of the benefits that microservices and container-based capability brings, whether that's your service catalog or your CI/CD or the ability to have self-healing capabilities within your application set if you're self-developing, the ability to now deploy container-based applications. But now you've got that flexibility of moving those containers seamlessly across one platform and now deploy it into the right place at the right time. and then shift it as those needs move. So we see, and this is why it was such a big announcement between Nutanix and Red Hat, is to really enable that joining of a ubiquitous infrastructure capability and an obfuscated cloud deployment with that richness and that market leading position that Red Hat have around the microservices and container-based capability. So once again, it really does come back to, really making sure that those applications have, complete transportability and usability across all those different areas. Again, I've had a lot of feedback that says, look, this looks really great, but, organizations are tight on budget. They're certainly tight on, funding and other elements. And, this is a great theory, but, there's just not the capability and, to invest in this sort of thing and to kind of up some of those IT costs. And what we see though is that quite the opposite, rather than necessarily being, huge cost and allocation, when you start to look at things more efficiently and effectively, and you start to look at those allocations of cost at a total cost perspective, whether that's education and training, whether it's speed of deployment and so forth, what we see across the globe is that we have about a 50% improved total cost of ownership of an infrastructure platform that's looked at from an end-to-end perspective, rather than managing each of those different clouds in a siloed type manner. You get more efficiency of capital deployment. You get more efficiency of people. You're just not doing as much feeding and watering of your infrastructure as what you used to, and so you really are able to change your total cost of ownership quite substantially and reduce that total cost of ownership over a period of time. Well, the other thing we hear a lot is that ultimately we know that our crystal balls are broken, that we really can't predict what the future is going to bring, whether that's macro changes to the world, the COVIDs, the licensing models, the global competition, et cetera, or even at a micro level where, the organization changes, lines of business, want to engage with different customer sets, different markets, et cetera. IT really has struggled for a long time, and COVID was really the straw that broke the camel's back that says we just can't predict the future, and trying to build out that capability is really, really difficult. So what we now look at from a capability perspective is this concept of just-in-time resource acquisition. So no longer do you need to worry about architecting 5 years in the future and building big storage arrays and doing big long-term contracts with cloud providers that provide minimum commitments and so forth. When you start to look at it from an obfuscated layer and a capability that sits across all those elements, what you can now do is acquire capacity where you need it in very small chunks. And because we run typically on industry standard infrastructure, you'll hear shortly from Lenovo and our partnership there with Lenovo, we are able to now consume that industry standard capability, which is first class and absolutely rock solid in its capability, but it's very quick to deploy. No 16, 18 weeks worth of deployment typically. You can get this infrastructure really quickly, deploy it on the ground, get it up and running. It's one-click deployment. It takes literally minutes to get a new node added into the environment. And so now you can really look at a very short window for when you acquire those resources. Again, because you don't have to really worry about those big ticket architectures and designs, you really are able to align the supply and capacity, or the demand and the capacity curves. Typically what happens from a IT perspective is we look into the future, and I used to be a CTO, I've run big ticket infrastructures in the past. What we used to find is that we'd have to worry about what it's going to look like. We'd have to think about the needs of the business, what we think going to be the demand curve, and then we'd have to build the right sets of infrastructure, the right, say, SAN, and the right number of array controllers, or the right number of disk shelves. And yes, you can do some expansion, but there's oftentimes model breaks that you need to do. So typically what's happened is that we've gone and we've had to buy all of this really high expensive infrastructure, stick it on the ground, and then basically that's sunk cost. That's money that can't be spent on other things that the business could do. And then as we go down into the future and we start to consume it, one of two things happens. Either we got it wrong in that we underspec'd what we needed, where we just don't have enough infrastructure. Business needs grew faster than we'd expected. And that means inevitably a cap in the hand back to the CFO saying, please, sir, can I have some more? And quite frankly, CFOs have now got to the point where they're starting to say no to some of those requests because they've just plowed way too much sunk cost into IT. Or the other thing is that we get it wrong and that we've overspec'd and that the demand hasn't come as quickly as we thought, which inevitably means that we've essentially got an opportunity cost where that capital could have been spent on acquiring new business, going after new customer bases, et cetera, et cetera. Neither of which makes the CFO particularly happy with IT. And we've certainly seen across a lot of different companies and industry segments where that relationship between IT and the finance holders or the CFO is becoming more and more fractured in a lot of respects. And following along from that school of thought, again, the ability to have these big, long-winded ROIs where the project takes 12, 18 months, 2 years, eventually we'll get some benefit out of it over the next sort of 3 to 4 year period. Essentially those days, in my humble opinion and what I'm seeing from a lot of different customers are largely gone. People want ROIs in another 12 months. They want to have the ability to be able to demonstrate that they can give back to the organization, a better position from a financial perspective in that financial year. And certainly from a Nutanix perspective, we're able to do a lot of that. We also get to eliminate the unlucky project. And I'm sure we've all seen them in the past where, the project comes along that unfortunately, it's out of sand space, it's out of blades in the chassis, it's out of, cards in the switch, et cetera, and it suddenly has to go and find hundreds, if not thousands of dollars, hundreds of thousands of dollars to buy more infrastructure because it was the unlucky project. Now, what that inevitably means is that projects that maybe not as beneficial from a business perspective have gotten up because they don't have to wear the true cost of the infrastructure and the underpinning capability, and projects that potentially should have gotten up because they have to wear that additional cost suddenly don't get up because they were the unlucky project. By having that capability that sits across all the infrastructure and that visibility we get, what we can now start to do is do proper allocation of resources and workloads back to the projects that's driving it. In fact, what we're able to do now is do predictive analysis. We can now plug in capability. What is this project going to mean? What resources are going to consume? Do I need to buy more resources? What do they look like? What's the allocation? And we can now start to make some really informed decisions as to which project should get the Guernsey and which project shouldn't. And then finally, I guess, oftentimes it's about people. What we see from a day two operations perspective is that, people really are a key part of what we're looking at from an organization perspective. And it's been, again, very interesting from a COVID perspective that without people coming in from overseas, without 457 visas, without immigration into the country, we really are in a position where we've got a really constrained labor market, and finding people is very, very difficult at the moment. We've got some of our organizations have 30 and 40 open headcount at the moment, which they just can't fill. And so people are now, organizations aren't really looking at how do I reduce my headcount. What they're really looking at is saying, how do I get my people out of non-value adding capability and into more functions and processes that actually make a difference to the organization? Essentially, how do I get in out of feeding and watering and those back office type tasks? And that's where things like automation and, software deployment, one-click deployments, one-click upgrades, all those sort of fun things, really do really pay dividends. And to a large degree, that's where a lot of the public cloud movement has come from, and that organizations really don't want to deal with that underpinning capability. And the public cloud really does do a very good job of delivering a lot of that. From our perspective, though, what we're able to do is take that same level of automation, that same level of lack of need to invest in people to do all of that, amalgamating and bringing stuff together. We can now automate and obfuscate all of that workload and process and essentially give the same outcome from your private cloud infrastructure, from your distributed edge infrastructure, and even from your public cloud as well, into that single platform that sits across the top. So it really can reduce those day two operations quite substantially from what we need. And just talking about day two operations, I'd be remiss if I didn't, you know, and certainly it's a slide that we're very proud of from our perspective. From a Nutanix perspective, we have one of the highest NPSs of any organization in the world. We run at 90+ NPS from a customer perspective. Our customers genuinely love the post implementation support they get from Nutanix. We are second to none, and as you can see, they're double most of our competitors in the IT world. But even just in a straight NPS score, 90% NPS is pretty much unheard of, and we've now been running that at 5 years now, and certainly the intent is to continue to run at 90+ as we move forward. So you know you're in a safe pair of hands when you've got, you know, our customers tell us that they are well supported and well structured as they go through not only their day one deployments but their day two operations. And with that, I am pretty much right on time from an allocation perspective. So look, I just wanted to say thank you all for giving the opportunity to have a bit of a chat. Hopefully there was some food for thought there for you to think about, not just from a Nutanix perspective, but just from an industry as a whole, where certainly we see as a global organization, workloads moving, some of the needs that organizations really do you know, need to think about from an engagement perspective, and ultimately, you know, what are some of the challenges, and that there is some ways to solve some of those challenges from an organizational perspective. Look, I wish you the very best for the rest of the day. Hopefully, you know, we can all get out of these Zoom sessions in the not too distant future as we get beyond COVID. But yeah, have a great conference and hopefully yeah, learn some things throughout the rest of the day.
Thanks very much, Matt, for that informative session. There's certainly a lot of people that are in the conference today that will get some good value out of that. BES has been a Nutanix partner for quite a while, and obviously, like many businesses, we've seen the need to transform and expand the breadth of services that are on offer. So for lots of people who think they know Nutanix, it's probably a great time to investigate all the new offerings that are available from Nutanix as a company. They're constantly diverging and offering different platforms, and they're not just a HCI company, which is what we traditionally probably think of for most people with Nutanix. They offer a lot more. So thanks very much for that session.